right, we'll get started. I will open it for questions as we go. If you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand during the presentation. Let's keep this interactive if we can, and we'll go from there. So, the topic is aligning your DevOps strategy to your Agile transformation. So this is the abstract, just so that if you request the slides, that it's all here together. So I don't expect you to read this in the moment. Hopefully that's why you showed up. So let's start with the question about why should you align your strategy, right? So, obviously the topic is about aligning it. Why should the two things be aligned? So first of all, when we talk about Agile, we talk about these as the goals of Agile. That you want to be more predictable, have an earlier ROI, you want to innovate, you want to have higher quality, lower costs, a better product fit. And all of these are potential goals of why you're doing an Agile transformation. All of these are values that you can also achieve from your DevOps implementation. So ultimately, the goals are the same. What we're trying to achieve is the same. So that's a first reason to align your DevOps with your Agile transformation. But there's other reasons that are kind of foreseen in some of the times that DevOps fails, and or large organizations struggle with DevOps. So one of the things in the abstract that talks about is it's pretty easy to implement DevOps on a greenfield project if you just have one small team. But if you have thousands of developers with hundreds of systems that you've been building over decades, it's very hard to move to a DevOps posture. Sometimes DevOps fails because of practice issues. You have very complex applications. The builds are very complex, have lots of different moving pieces, and it's not easy for any one team to solve the problem. So the builds need to cross different team boundaries. There's a lack of builds and test automation skills in the teams. So you've got the most complex builds you're ever going to have if you have a big legacy portfolio, and your team has done the least DevOps that they are going to do because they just don't have the experience yet. And also the features cross teams. So it's not that you can build one feature without others. So those are some practice issues that if you're not doing some of the Agile practices or don't have experience with the DevOps practices, that are going to be a challenge. There's also some cultural issues that the DevOps and a DevOps culture is designed to solve, right? So broken builds are not seen as a number one priority. So we need to get this feature built. We can't worry about the build. Obviously, the issue with that is that the builds and the DevOps, with the test, tell you whether you're moving forward or if you broke something that used to work. So that's the challenge. Build automation is someone else's job. So, that's my job is to write software. Someone else's job to make sure that it can get into a build. Or teams are not trusted or trustworthy. So what we want is to have the organization trusting, delegating into the teams. And if the teams aren't at that point yet, then having them accountable for their builds and deployments is often not something that can happen early on. Or there's silos in the organization. So maybe IT and the business aren't aligned and things are passed over the wall through an ops team or what have you, versus we have product alignment where we have a product and the business and the technology and product people are all in the same team in order to handle that. So these are different reasons that DevOps fails. And some of these are also targeted by an Agile transformation. So again, reasons to make sure that the priorities are aligned. So if you think about why should I align my strategy, you can't afford to wait to do DevOps. But the converse of that is the organization isn't ready oftentimes for a full DevOps implementation. So we're not ready, but we can't wait. So what we need to do is do a transformation that gets us step by step there, and that's going to lead into kind of my next topic of how we approach transformation. So in order for me to talk about aligning your DevOps, your Agile transformation, I have to talk a little bit about Agile transformation. And there's different approaches you can take to a transformation. And we definitely have an opinion about how you should do that. So you can take a systems approach, meaning the systems within your organization, like how do we build teams? How do we get work to teams? How do we prioritize features? How do we, and then how do we actually go through the mechanics of organizing and transforming? What's our governance? What's our structure? What's our metrics? Things like that from a organization and systems perspective. You can have a culture first approach or a practices approach. So, the systems, right? Or the culture, let's start with, right? So I'm changing hearts and minds. I want people to care about the builds. I want people to think it's their responsibility. I want people to own that it's, every change should, every, set of changes should be deployable often, weekly or every other week or what have you, right? That delivery systems, if we get the right culture, we get people to care about the right things, then the practices and the systems will emerge within our organization, right? That's kind of a culture first transformation. Let's start with the hearts and minds. The second type of transformation is we can start with the practices, right? We can teach, here's how you do continuous integration. Here's how you do version control. Here's how you do continuous deployment. We'll teach the teams those skills. And then as they build those things up, that's going to affect the culture and the systems, right? If we teach these practices, then things will get better, in the organization. And then, I talked about this a little bit, but from a systems approach, right, aligning the organization first to deliver value, and then iteratively and incrementally rolling out Agile as part of that. So how do we create the right conditions? What has to be true such that a team can successfully implement DevOps, or what has to be true so a team can successfully provide predictable or high velocity or high value. So I'm going to take this very much from a systems first time kind of perspective and walk through how we roll out DevOps within that perspective. So let's look at that. What is the system that I'm going to use? And there's other systems that can be used to roll out Agile, but what I would say is make sure that you're creating the conditions for the team to be successful before you're starting to put practices into them, because otherwise the teams may fail and your investment's going to be wasted. So, all right. So what is the system of transformation? How do we look at an Agile transformation? So first of all, we look, different teams need to get to different points in this grid, right? So, if you look at the left, we have predictability, and at the right, we have adaptability, right? Is it more important to be predictable and we just need slow and steady wins the race, or do we have to be really adaptable in our software? In different systems, maybe we have a commodity backend package that can be more in that we just need to be predictable. And then we have a e-commerce site that needs to change with the times. It needs to be very adaptable. And then what's happening to my market, right? Is it fairly stable, or is it being disrupted, right? So if it's being highly disrupted, I need to be more emergent. If it's not, I can be more convergent. So we take teams from where they are and we say we need to go step by step through a transformation. So a team will start most often when we meet them that they're trying to be predictable, and they're in a market that's being disrupted, and they say, okay, we need to do an agile transformation. So for us, the first goal then, and we talk about treks to base camp. So the analogy is we're climbing a mountain, and you don't just go from the bottom to the top, that you stop at various base camps and you build your capability to get step by step through that transformation. And what we're going to do after this slide is then relate each of these DevOps practices and how do we align them to this transformation approach. So first, we want to stabilize the system. So we want to go, and our goal is to just be predictable and get a predictable team that can be trusted to provide results, and that's something that we can then start to improve. And then we want to reduce the batch size and start producing smaller releases and becoming more incremental in what we're building. And then we need to start breaking dependencies. In the first two, we're just trying to be predictable. We're trying to do smaller batch sizes. We may have to put a bunch of scaffolding in place so that multiple teams can coordinate their work, and that systems that are all tightly coupled and dependent on each other can work with each other. And so that build systems in the DevOps context, just by stabilizing the system or reducing the batch size, we still may have very complicated builds that cross team boundaries or cross system boundaries. And then we want to increase autonomy of those teams. And then ultimately, we want to be able to have some of our teams get to the level where they want to invest and learn. So this is the typical skunkworks type project, or the real isolated, we're going to hit the market many times, think of lean startup type teams. Okay, so if we look through this as a frame for here's how we're talking about our agile transformation. Now, how do we align our DevOps strategy to that? All right, so this is another picture of it. You can see these different base camps along this trek. And so how do we align that transformation? So let's talk about base camp 1, right? Our goal is to stabilize the system. We're trying to improve predictability and quality, right? So, let's look at the next piece, right? So what has to be true to do this, right? I don't want this to become a completely an agile transformation talk. And so we have a series of outcomes that we believe are necessary in order for us to stabilize the system and be predictable. And I picked 3 of them just as an example. We need to form teams, right? So we need a team that stays together, that doesn't just come with a project and go away when a project's done, that we have a team that we bring work to, and that team can continuously improve over time, right? We have to establish the flow of work to that team that can be a predictable set of work that's coming, so that we can, again, have them be predictable. And the team needs to then get into a cadence where it can make and meet commitments, right? So there's more things that have to happen to get to base camp 1, but those are 3 things. Now, from a DevOps perspective, what do I want to do in order to help be predictable and high quality, right? And you can make the argument that any practice within DevOps could help with predictability and quality, but primarily, though, first of all, kind of back to the preconditions, right? we have to have teams staying together to be able to sustain DevOps. If not, what's going to happen is the builds won't continue to get invested in, the tests won't continue to get invested in, and we'll have automated a bunch of things that over time become stale and aren't kept up to speed with the changing code and the changing environment. So from a DevOps perspective, the practices that we tend to invest in during Basecamp 1 are source control, build automation, and deployment automation, right? So we just want to get, again, to where we're predictable. If you're building off of laptops, if you're building in inconsistent ways, then you're not going to be predictable. Sometimes things will work in the test environment, sometimes they won't. Sometimes things will be consistent, and sometimes you'll break things. So if we can start to have build automation, deployment automation, and as part of those, run any automated tests we have, so that we start to become predictable, and we know that every time we deploy, every time we move to another environment, we're getting the same results. Ultimately, this is the foundation that teams need to have. Now, some of these things, right? So the source control may be local source control. It might not be for all of the systems, or all of the environment settings might not be in version control yet. The build automation might just be for your team stuff, or it might be need to be run by other teams because you can't control your own build at this point, right? And again, deployments, you likely will not be, if you're in a large environment, able to control and do your own deployments. So some of these things you'll have constraints around, but this is kind of the first step of investing. So now, as we move and we've achieved that and we're predictable, now we need to start moving to smaller batch sizes, right? If we're not predictable, moving to releasing more often and having more releases is going to be a non-starter. So you can see we're kind of iteratively and incrementally rolling out Agile, and we're going to be iteratively and incrementally investing in DevOps as we go, right? So let's look at what has to be true in order to have smaller batch sizes, right? In order to do more frequent releases with smaller units of value, first of all, we have to have smaller backlog items, right? If our backlog item is, I need these 33 things and you can't release without all of them, then that's not going to work for releasing more often. And I need more granular so that I can measure the progress of the team as they're going, right? And one of the things as we're doing this, you're releasing, let's say you get smaller backlog items, you get to where you could do a production release every month or every 2 weeks or what have you, or every quarter. Some are moving from annual to quarterly, right? You get through those things. Releasing more often at the same cost per release actually increases your costs, right? So we need to identify a plan to eliminate waste, right? So what are the things, if we want to do this more often, we have to do it with less drag, less waste. And manual builds or coordinating with other teams or what have you are all places of waste that DevOps can help automate away and do things. So if in Basecamp 1, right, you could become predictable just by having a manual set of instructions to say, here's how you test this. Or you could become predictable just by having a manual set of instructions to say, here's how you do a deployment. But now if you want to do that every day, every week, every month, it's gonna take more and more costs and more overhead, right? So like the key thing to think about when you're aligning now is, as I'm trying to get the smaller releases, that's gonna mean that I need to reduce the cost per release. And one thing that DevOps can provide early value on is reducing that cost per release by making things consistent, but also by removing the manual steps that need to happen as part of that. So the practices in Basecamp 2, again, some organizations have not gotten through source control, build automation, and deployment automation. So you're continuing to stack on top of that. But this is where continuous integration becomes more and more important, right? So if I'm trying to do a release every 2 weeks, I can't wait till the end to do a build and see how it works, right? If I do that every quarter, do it every 6 months, I can have an integration phase, but I can't have an integration phase of a 2-week project or a month project. It's too much overhead. And so when you're doing an agile transformation, you'll get, well, if we do smaller releases, this overhead's going to kill us. And the answer is yes, but what we need to do is reduce the cost of the overhead, because the feedback and because the iterative and incremental learnings are so important that we need to do frequent releases. And if we need to do that, then things like continuous integration now save us money versus are a cost to implement for the organization, right? So now I've gotten my teams and my releases stabilized, so I'm predictable, and I'm making smaller bets. But now we need to start breaking dependencies, right? For individual teams to truly be agile, they need to be able to build, test, deploy, and enhance their application without being dependent on everybody else. So in Basecamps 1 and 2, we've allowed those dependencies and we've orchestrated around them. We put in compensating controls to deal with them so that we can become more predictable and get smaller, more frequent releases. But now we need to start to cut some of those dependencies to have a truly agile team that's able to work on components of the application. So what has to be true for me to break dependencies, to have teams that can build, test, and deploy and enhance a component, right? We have to know what the dependencies are, right? So first, one of the things we'll do as part of this project from the beginning is not just define teams randomly. We're going to define teams around business capability, so that this is something that this business capability could move forward to a higher base camp, or it could stay back at a lower base camp. But we understand the business capability. Now that business capability may require multiple systems or a portion of a system or a set of services in order to do that business capability. So so I need to understand now, what are all the dependencies between my business capability and other business capabilities. I need to understand the benefits of removing those dependencies. So if I have an area of the business, let's say e-commerce, or let's say cart within e-commerce, that I need to change rapidly because the way people purchase my products is changing. It used to be that it was a face-to-face sale, and here's how it worked. And now, consumers expect to be able to buy it through an online experience, right? Something like that. I need to understand the dependencies, and then I need to know the benefits of removing them. And then I need to remove and isolate those dependencies. So those dependencies could be dependencies between two business capabilities. So one can't get deployed without the other, and they can't move forward independently. So they could be technical dependencies, they could be process dependencies, and they could be just DevOps dependencies where we haven't created a encapsulated build, we haven't created isolated builds. And so as we move to these encapsulated components, and we want our teams to be able to build more independently, we need to move to encapsulated DevOps, where we can build those components and you can upgrade one component without upgrading all components. This means, again, going back to it's got to be inexpensive to test, it's got to be inexpensive to build, it's got to be inexpensive to deploy. Because if one component wants to do an upgrade and not all of them, I can't have all the other teams slow down because of that. Otherwise, I'll have to start aligning all the releases again. So coincidentally, this is the time when we see, so initially with DevOps, since things are so, in complex environments, things have to be done across teams. A lot of times there's a DevOps team that's outside the team that does DevOps for multiple teams. And that's partially because the skill sets don't exist on all the teams. That's partially because the builds have to be orchestrated across multiple teams. But as we have teams that can own a set of capabilities that are encapsulated, more and more of the DevOps responsibility can move inside the team room. Now, the accountability, some of the things, because of separation of concerns and so forth, may still be executed by an ops team, may still be run by something. But if you think about it as a Venn diagram, instead of 3 circles, now the DevOps is the overlap of the dev and the ops teams. And the dev team is responsible for, just like they have to automate the code to do a business function, they have to automate the build to make that business function available in software. The ops team will make sure that, that there's the right separation of concerns and the right approvals and so forth. But it becomes much more of a shared partnership than it's something that some other team does as we get to this encapsulated teams Basecamp 3 type level. So you'll see here that I'm talking about the exact same practices, right? So source control, build automation, deployment automation, and continuous integration. What's happening though is deployment automation and continuous integration are now for these encapsulated components and not for big monolithic systems. And that more of the responsibility for creating this automation and for doing the continuous integration is moving into the team room, because the skills have been developed over the last several base camps, as well as we've removed the dependencies and we've made it possible for these teams to work more independently and be more responsive to their business and their customer need, within that part of the organization. This is where it starts to get interesting. So if I'm doing DevOps and I've got a greenfield project, I could start where I have a small team that's building this new capability. They're already independent and nimble and able to manage their own product backlogs, right? So you can start at Basecamp 4, and for new code and new environments using new technologies, it's not as hard to implement some of these capabilities. But what has to be true at this point is that we have these broken dependencies from Basecamp 3, and now teams can become more autonomous. They can own more of their builds. They can own more things. So maybe I got a little ahead of myself of things coming into the team room. It can happen during Basecamp 3, but Basecamp 3 is kind of a precursor. As I get the teams to have more autonomy, DevOps is going to move more often into the team room. And here you'll see that, again, the practices don't change that much, except for we add continuous deployment, right? So it's very hard to do continuous deployment where new features, when they're done, are just put into production or put to the next environment or what have you, when you don't have encapsulated teams. So until you get past Basecamp 3, trying to espouse to the organization that whenever a feature is done, we should just put it into production and not have this rigid cadence of when things can go in. That's really impossible until you get to a Basecamp 4 type stance. First of all, we're not at Basecamp 1, so we're not predictable. So why would we expect the business to trust us to put individual features to go do this continuous deployment if we haven't gotten predictable? If we don't have small batch sizes, so we don't have the ability to build small incremental pieces, and we haven't broken dependencies, so making that piece independent of all others has not been accomplished. So until I achieve Basecamp 1, 2, and 3, I really can't focus on continuous deployment. The best thing to be doing is focusing on the previous practices. And I don't have on the slide, but an assumption going all the way from build automation to deployment automation to continuous integration is that we're building up our test automation, right? We're doing more and more releases, we're building more and more capability. It can't be a burdensome manual process to be sure that we didn't break what used to work, right? So, and we clearly can't do continuous deployment if we don't have a scalable way to make sure that we didn't break things that used to work while we were building this new feature.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
With regard to that. It seems, is there a way in your experience that you've seen that right before continuous deployment, there's like a continuous delivery or some type of staging apparatus that it can be placed in before it's actually released into the wild?
Yeah, for sure. So, and this probably gets a little bit into semantics of what different people call things. There's people who, as part of their continuous integration, they will get the code in, they will do a build, and it automatically goes into their dev environment, or automatically goes into their staging environment, or what have you. There's very few organizations that, you make a change, a build goes green, and then that feature change automatically goes into production, right? So you need to move toward that direction. Anything after we've built it that we find in a development environment or a testing environment or a staging environment, we should ask the question, could we have found that earlier? And what would we have done to make sure that we never have that same issue again, right? But there's always going to be exploratory testing. There's always going to be the need for people to look at it and deploy it. And there's always going to be some level of separation of concerns, right? The same people who build your software, aren't going to be the people who can change your production environment. So, so I think that continuous deployment or continuous delivery, there's probably the spectrum of continuous integration that I'm taking my changes and your changes, getting them together, and all the developers can see it. We're getting that together, the developers can see it, and we get it to the testers or to into the testing environment. Maybe the same team that's doing the testing, and then continuing to go forward with that. So that's a good question. And yeah, I think it's a migration. And again, as you build, trust and confidence, then people will start to lean out the process and say, well, why are we doing this stuff? We never find anything, right?
I really like the point. I really like the point that you just brought out that I had never really considered. And that is the spectrum concept of continuous integration. I think that was really great. Great point. Great call out too.
Yeah, and I think, so a lot of times, again, I'm talking a lot about, like, we have this system for getting us from point A to point Z. And we're trying to build into the organization this trust and this capability so that we're building out, in this example, our DevOps capability. The same thing's happening. So continuous integration is a tool, right? There's a tool that'll look at your source code. If something changed, it'll run your build, it'll run your tests, it'll put it in a directory. But it's also a system or a philosophy, right? That says, you know, anything I'm doing later means that I've lost context, it costs me money and time and so forth. So whenever I make a change, I want to make sure it works with everything else. And if it breaks, that means I no longer know where I'm at and I need to fix it and move forward, right? And so as you're building that knowledge and that trust and that practice, you're going to start to build that culture around it. And as you build the culture around continuous integration and the culture around continuous deployment, then you're going to be able to start, doing that continuous delivery. So I think, I believe culture is an output of having a system that empowers people to do the right practices. And then as you're doing those things, obviously you don't focus on one thing exclusively, but I'm very much a systems first, type approach to these things. So now Basecamp 5, right? So ultimately what we're talking about doing is investing to learn, right? So let's say you're a bank and there's new financial companies offering new products and you want to invent a new lending product, right? There's certain things you can't innovate without getting the right regulatory approval. There's other things that you can change very rapidly about how you talk to customers, about how things are done. Or if you're, a car company and, there's more and more automation going to vehicles. There's more and more experiences as part of your product, right? So as you're there, you may want to have some of your teams go to Basecamp 5, where you can have a lean startup type approach where you're putting new features, new capabilities in front of users, getting rapid feedback, and changing those. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting there. One is, you don't have some of the infrastructure or constraints you had before because you're building a new capability, but you need the ability to automate and get new changes in and out of an environment quickly, because now things you may want to do A/B testing where you have two different versions of the same system and you want to see which one are giving you better results, or some users get one feature, some users get another, and then over time you migrate to the one that's more effective, and all of those require kind of the full stack of DevOps capabilities, right? And for these teams, DevOps needs to be like breathing. It needs to be second nature, because they need to be able to constantly be thinking about the feedback and the customer and not see as a constraint getting releases in front of the customer, getting feedback back from a customer. So in this case, the DevOps practices, again, source control and build automation and deployment automation are kind of second nature. But continuous deployment, even advanced automation like creating environments, creating databases, creating systems, right? So maybe I'm having infrastructure as code in this type of an environment. I need a lot more of those types of things as I'm doing some of these rapid ideations at a Basecamp 5 level. Ultimately, that's kind of the talk in a nutshell. If you want the deck, if you text DevOps to this number, you will get the deck. Additionally, we did an Elevate Agile conference, and if you want the access to the videos and the content from that talk, you can text Teams to the same number. So I will put this on here and open it up for questions or comments.
Didn't want to dominate the conversation, but I find I really like your approach, and I like the deck that you gave. A couple of things that I really found that was really useful from my perspective is understanding to help them understand where they are, because in my specific case, they are well down the road of understanding what basic Scrum, basic Agile, those types of things, but not too much has been invested in the infrastructure for a CI/CD pipeline or DevOps. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we really need to start to have. And how, in your experience, have you been able to start those conversations? Because not everybody has made that investment, because sometimes people are running down the Scrum and Agile road without really considering the architecture piece.
I usually start with this, there's goals, ultimately, why should we do DevOps, right? And I would look at a problem that's in the organization and say, is it a predictable thing? Is it a lower the cost thing? Is it earlier ROI because we can do more releases more often, or what have you? So I would start with the benefit. Right? What is the value that we're trying to achieve in order to get there? And then I ask, questions to understand what is preventing us from achieving that, right? So we're doing multiple releases, but it's 30% overhead in order to get a release out. How can we get that to 5% overhead? And so that instead of having 70% value density where we're building features 70% of the time, and 30% of the time is overhead of just the mechanics of getting work into the team and getting work out of the team. How do we get to where that's 80% value density or 90% value density? And what you'll find is that teams that have just focused on Scrum and haven't focused on some of the technical practices, their value density is lower than it could be, and therefore we can get more predictable and lower costs by investing in DevOps. So bringing it back to these goals is important, because that's what organizations use in order to decide to invest. Versus leading with the practices, and saying, well, we should do continuous integration. That doesn't mean much to a lot of people. Like, they don't understand what that means. So I would lead with the benefits, then understand in our environment what is the friction that's preventing us from having that benefit, and then hopefully you should get some traction.